Hello and welcome to this second panel of the session, which we are focusing on the economic relationships between the Western Bloc and China, if we can say, and we could talk about blocks. Always having in mind that it's very difficult to segregate these both domains. They are both parts of the same equation of these relationships, but for practical reasons, we are focusing now on economics, commercial and technological relationships between the two blocks. We have here scholars, we have academics, we have politicians, we have high diplomatic officials, and then we have journalists like me that try to just navigate in these muddled waters that is the international arena, and we try to explain to the people what's going on in the world with plain and simple words and clear ideas. So I'm very grateful for the panelists we've had until now with for the blunt ideas with a clear vision, and I hope this will go on now with this new panel. We have luxury people who are going to talk right now. As a short introduction, we are all aware that China and the US are the two economic superpowers of the world, and they are, if we cannot say war, maybe almost at least a commercial war. That, for example, Donald Trump started when he was in the White House, opposing important tariffs on Chinese goods, and now he has threatened to increase those tariffs up to 60% on Chinese goods. This is not a war, maybe it's close to that if he does so. We have China, which is ahead in control of some of the domains which are going to shape in our near future, such as 5G technology, such as international artificial intelligence, and such as the control and access to very crucial materials and minerals and raw materials that are very well needed for the green transition. So China is now leading, for example, the manufacturing of wind turbines and maybe electrical batteries and other elements needed for this green transition. So it's a death competition, maybe we can say it like that. We have the European Union in the middle, who struggles to find its place in this scenario. And we have the US and the EU both implementing or threatening to implement protectionist measures against China. For example, we've seen a ban of exports of semiconductors from the US to China. We've seen now the European Commission, which is opening an investigation regarding electrical vehicles from China which are sold in Europe, and accusing the Chinese government of illegally subsidizing these vehicles and thus posing an unfair competition to European manufacturers. So the relation is very strained now, and let's see how it evolves, taking into account the political changes that are going to come possibly this 2024 year, which is crucial for international relations and this relationship. So to talk about this, we have, as I said, very distinguished panelists. We have Dr. Mariette Lovely, which is an Anthony Solomon Senior Fellow from the Peterson Institute for International Economics. We have Dr. Jan Nuric, which is a political economy institution senior lecturer at Lao China Institute, and Dr. François Nicolas, which is a senior advisor and Center for Asian Studies of the Institut Français des Relations Internationales. We have agreed that we will change a little bit the order of their interventions, because we would like first to hear about the Chinese economy, which is another leg of the equation. As we know, the pandemic is taking its toll on Chinese economy. The Chinese miracle is maybe coming to an end, and it's a spectacular economic growth is slowing very fast. So let's see how this impacts on this scenario we are talking about. And so, Dr. Nuric, please, your turn.
Okay, thank you, Syria, for the great introduction, and it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me. And yes, indeed, it is a particularly fascinating time, actually, to talk about the Chinese economy. And that is because the Chinese economy this past year is in a very unusual phase that I think you could argue was largely unexpected even a year ago. So we expected China to come out of COVID. It had these lockdowns, and we expected China to come out of COVID very, with a boom and be very successful economically. And what happened is that China has been struggling. After a short period of boom, it has been struggling. And this is also unexpected if we look at China's economic history over the past 40 years. It has had unprecedented economic growth, large-scale wealth creation. I like to always point out that it lifted basically all of its population out of poverty. And it has become the world's factory, generating massive trade surpluses for itself by exporting to the rest of the world. And it even did well during COVID. We shouldn't forget the first half of the pandemic when we were struggling with our economies and with lockdown, and China seemed to have overcome it and was supplying the rest of the world with all kinds of tech and face masks and so on. But suddenly things look very different. Suddenly we have a China that appears to be struggling. Now, the Chinese economy grew 5.2% last year, admittedly, which is an impressive number. So we would be happy in Europe to achieve growth rates of that kind. But it is not particularly high for Chinese standards, and it does not seem to match the experience on the ground in China, where there is this experience or this perception that the economy is in a bad state. Record falls in house prices, the stock market has gone down, foreign investment in China is drying up. That's a big statistic this year. China is facing deflation, capital is leaving the country, and there's a high jobless rate, especially among the young. And so there's a mismatch, and we can argue whether these 5.2% are an accurate number or not. People disagree on that, but certainly there is a problem with the Chinese economy at the moment. And the key problem is really that these difficulties the Chinese economy is having appear to be structural increasingly appear to be structural rather than sort of a temporary economic downturn that will disappear in a couple of months with a renewed sort of period of economic success. There is a sense that what has contributed to China's economic growth in the past is not working anymore, and that a fundamental rethink of China's economic model is needed. So I'll give you several examples of such structural challenges that China is facing. One is that China has amassed a large amount of debt from investing massively in its economy over the past decades, and it cannot take the risk anymore to further invest in its economy through building infrastructure, through construction activities, the way it has done in the past, because it would have to take on even more debt. And an example of the problems that result from this is, you can see it in China's real estate sector, which is a key driver of China's growth, but has had enormous problems over the past 2 to 3 years, which you can see in big Chinese companies failing spectacularly over their debt obligations. So there is a major crisis in the real estate sector as one example of this debt problem that China is facing. The next structural issue that China is facing is that its population is rapidly aging, even declining now, and declining as well. Its fertility rate is now at 1.09 children per woman. So that was in 2022. And that means the population at working age is declining. And so one source of competitiveness of China's economy, namely having low-cost labor, is under threat because that labor is becoming more and more expensive. At the same time, this aging population means that China has to sort of rethink how it deals with social security. A lot of young people having to support a greater number of old people. A third problem that is often brought up in this context is a re-emphasis on the state, on the role of the state in the Chinese economy under President Xi Jinping. I will bring one particular example. There was a crackdown on tech companies in China, Tencent, Alibaba, etc. which are all private companies. There's an idea that these private companies, some of them have become too powerful and something needs to be done about them. And there's a certain re-emergence of a preference for state-owned firms. And also the COVID lockdowns you saw last year is sort of a demonstration of the sort of force the state can have in an authoritarian country. And obviously these also had enormous impacts on the economy. And the fourth structural problem, I would say, how much more time do I have? Just a little bit more. 3-4 minutes? Good. The fourth structural problem is that these geopolitical rivalries with the United States and the West more broadly. So there are efforts now in the West, obviously, to reduce the risk from economic exposure to and dependence on China. And the previous panelists have talked about it. And the idea is to shift some supply chains out of China, shift them elsewhere, either to countries in Southeast Asia or India or Africa or closer to home. All right? So one example is that last year Mexico surpassed China to become the biggest exporter of goods to the United States, I think since the first time in 20 years. So something is happening here, right? And there are other activities like greater screening of Chinese investments in the US and in Europe, and obviously the US prohibition of certain exports to China of chips and other strategically important products. So I would say these attempts at decoupling have not had a huge impact yet, but they are serious for China. We don't know how far that will go in the future. China is obviously at the moment benefiting, on the other hand, from better trade relations with Russia, where the West has withdrawn. It is selling enormous amounts of consumer goods and cars to Russia, and it has the opportunity to buy cheap oil and gas. But this is unlikely a game changer, given the size of the Russian economy is not huge, right? The Western countries are much more important for China in that sense. So these kind of challenges, that I just outlined, they are not new. So they emerged over the past decade, and things like the debt crisis in China have been an issue of concern for a long time. But in the past, these problems have kind of been acknowledged, right? But there was a general sense of optimism in China that the state or the country could deal with these challenges. And today, I think for the first time, really, you can see that there's sort of a breakaway in this confidence, right? And this breakaway in confidence is important to have economies going. If it breaks away, there could be a multiplier effect by which that could worsen things for China's economy even further. In the past, China has tried to overcome some of these challenges by boosting domestic consumption, but that has never really worked. China is not a culture of consumers and a society of consumers, and this lack of confidence, for example, will induce people to save more rather than consuming, so it is counterproductive. Yet, despite these problems we are seeing now, I'm not one of them who would be very skeptical about China's economic future. I think China will do okay in the next 5 to 10 years. I think China will muddle through, and sometimes even have there will be various bright spots. For example, you can see it. You mentioned many of them: AI, electric vehicles, and so on. China was the world's largest exporter of cars last year, just as an example, right? And China's investments internationally have rebounded last year, and so on. China has a high-quality labor force it can still build on, still got this large market, a strong industry. So it will be very difficult to decouple or remove oneself from China. I will leave it at this and pass on to the next speaker.
Well, thank you, Jan. Thank you to the organizers for inviting me here. I'm trying to get my glasses on with the headphone. I feel a little bit like the money changers in the temple of national security. So that's the role the economists play. But I do want to say that I think that a lot of the competition and conflict that we see does play out in the economic sphere. Economics is really central to the U.S.-China relationship, as well as the U.S.-EU relationship. And so I think it's right that the second panel tonight focuses on economics. I've been asked to talk about the U.S. approach, and I will. And I'll start by mentioning the U.S. position toward China, and it was already outlined by the U.S. Consul General. The U.S. basic approach to China is to invest, align, and compete. And the invest part is certainly best seen in recent legislation, historic legislation in the U.S. to invest in our infrastructure, in our industry, and in the climate transition, the energy transition. Aligning, we are trying to align with Europe. We have the creation of the TTC, Trade and Technology Council. U.S. is also trying to align with the other countries in the Indo-Pacific. So we have the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, which to date has produced some agreements, but nevertheless has begun a very important dialogue with countries in ASEAN and elsewhere. And last, compete. I think the U.S. has made it clear that it's not going to cede the field to China in innovation and research, in manufacturing, in information technology, and increasingly in development assistance and financing in developing countries. So invest, align, compete. I want to talk about how this approach manifests itself in the U.S. activities to build resilience in supply chains, because I think it's clear if we step back, sometimes we see the U.S. making a lot of actions, we don't see how these pieces of the puzzle fit together. First on reshoring, I think of reshoring as the investment piece. We are reshoring to ensure adequate domestic supplies of what we see as critical materials, and this particularly semiconductors and new energy. Also, we need to rebuild our own industrial base. So we have our own domestic reasons for wanting to do that, but this allows us to, in our view, control supply. So we're investing at home. Friendshoring is the aligning part in economic terms, and I think here is an important realization from the U.S. that it can't go it alone. And it can't go it alone in the usual diplomatic sense. It can't go it alone because there's very important economic reasons not to go it alone. It's the famed gains from trade. We still believe in the gains from trade and the importance of trading with others who have different competitive advantages. And lastly, de-risking. I think of this as competing, not ceding the playing field to China, diversifying our economic relationships, beginning to study where perhaps we have allowed our dependence to go too far. So an active intent to reduce U.S. reliance on China. It's what I called this morning, quoting Gwyneth Paltrow, conscious decoupling. So how is this strategy paying dividends both for the EU and for the U.S., and where is it falling short? I think in terms of dividends, the U.S. has really raised awareness about the risks of overconcentration. And I think if I've always said, if someone comes down from Mars and looks and says, so you guys have decided that 90% of all advanced semiconductors on which you are betting your future is going to be located on this one island? That doesn't make any sense. We would all say, yeah, it really doesn't make any sense, no matter what countries you put in that map. So I think we've raised awareness, and that's something that I think has paid dividends both for the U.S. and the EU. Second, we are actively working to reduce overdependence on the Greater China region for critical materials such as semiconductors, but also now looking forward into critical minerals for the energy transition. And lastly, I think we focused attention on the need to regulate and shape diffusion of new technologies. We're behind in this field. EU, I think, is moving ahead and can serve as a model for the U.S. here, but it's obviously very important. Also, I think that the EU will clearly celebrate the finally major U.S. action on climate change. This has to be viewed as important. The U.S., obviously, as a large carbon emitter, must be part of the solution. Now, what about the shortcomings? Well, despite reinvigorated U.S.-EU partnership under President Biden, we've seen the failure of the U.S. to anticipate and avoid the consequences of uncoordinated subsidization. Now, we can all perhaps admit that we have underinvested in climate and creating the energy transition, but the IRA caused I think, avoidable conflict. Now, was it avoidable from a political sense? We all know that major legislation in a fragmented country, you have all your states, we have our many representatives. It's a bit like making sausage. Sometimes it doesn't come out quite so right. So we've been working to go back and say, yes, we do all need to subsidize or invest more in these industries, but we'd be better off if we did it in a coordinated rather than an uncoordinated way. And I think we still have an enormous way to go in that, and hopefully we'll have the chance to do that in 2025. I think there's also been a retreat of the United States from global leadership on trade. It gives me absolutely no pleasure to say that, but I think it's quite obvious to anyone who studies. I think there's an acknowledgement that the current system is flawed. The U.S. has been very vocal in what it sees as the flaws of the WTO and failure of China to meet its obligations. But so far, it's offered no leadership on an alternative vision. And I think this is a serious shortcoming. We saw some attempt to do this in the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, but we've seen recently the U.S. pull back from negotiations on digital trade, which is, for those who have studied or have kept observed over time, U.S. pushing countries in terms of digital trade. It was quite astonishing. Lastly, I think there's been a failure to articulate a clear vision and strategy for peaceful coexistence with China. So if we go back to President von der Leyen's statement, de-risking without decoupling, like what does that mean? We have a right to ask that. And how will this manifest? Defend, dialogue, diversify. Well, defend, where do we pull back from existing integration? This is about conscious decoupling. What are the most important, strategically most important aspects for us to decouple? Have we really had that conversation? I think we are beginning to see the outlines. The U.S. has made very important strategic choices. And let's think about how far that needs to go and how we can do it. Dialogue. How do we build new relationships outside of the EU and the US for the needed diversification? We see a great example is we're trying to get a critical minerals agreement between our two regions, but we're having trouble there. Well, we all know that we're going to have to reach outside for critical minerals. So we need to dialogue. We need to be in agreement and dialogue beyond ourselves. Is dialogue enough if we don't also present a positive vision for what a renewed relationship or a satisfactory relationship or a peaceful relationship with China would look like? I think this is something that is sorely missing. We can't decouple from China and pretend that China is going to go away. China is 28% of global exports of manufactured goods. It's more than 1/4 of all the manufactured goods that are traded in the global economy. It's not going anywhere. What does it look like to live in a world where we are both important and peaceful? In conclusion, we have soberly, I think, finally faced the risk of integration. We have made historic investments in taking steps that reduce the risks of integration. We have faced challenges in aligning with the European Union and with other partners. As we have deployed these new tools, we need to refine them. We need to keep at it and not get discouraged. And lastly, I think we need a call to present a new vision for how to live in a peaceful, productive, and prosperous world. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. So first of all, let me thank the organizers for having me here. It's a pleasure to be in Barcelona. Not too sure my pronunciation is correct, but anyway. All right, well, the nice thing about being the last is that you can actually comment on what all the others have been saying. And so the first thing I would like to say is actually correct something that the chairperson said in the introduction, saying that there are two big powers, two big economic powers in the world, the US and China. And I'm afraid to say this is not the case. Actually, if you look at the EU as a bloc, and you should look at the EU as a bloc, the EU is the #1 economic power in the world. The problem is that it doesn't perceive itself as such, and it is not perceived as such either, which makes a big difference, of course. Anyway, so what I was supposed to talk about is precisely the EU's approach to China, but I will start by saying that I would like to give my own take on the US approach to China and the difference between the US and the EU's approaches to China. So what I would like to say on this specific point is, usually people say, well, the US and the EU share the same assessment of China and the Chinese threat. They see it exactly in the same way, but they disagree on how to provide a response to this threat. Well, I agree on the differences in the responses between the EU and the US, but I think that the difference in the responses actually comes from a difference in the assessment. And my own take is that for the US, China is really what I would call an existential threat. What I mean by that is that the US perceives China as more than a challenger. China wants to replace the US. China wants to be the number one instead of the US. And this is something, of course, that the US cannot accept. So this is really the way, I guess, the US sees China. So it is really more than a challenger. It is a potential replacement. And this is unbearable. So it is really the number one position that is at stake in the case of the US. And I think that plays out quite clearly in this rivalry, which has played out as a trade war. But actually behind the trade war, it's really a technological war. So behind the trade, it's tech that is at stake. In case of the EU, of course, this is not at all the same thing. As I just said earlier, even though the EU is the number one economic power, it does not perceive itself as such, and so it has never been the number one, and it's not a problem that there is another number one. So I think that it's a major difference in the assessment of the Chinese threat. In the case of the EU, what is at stake are EU jobs, are the EU's economic stability, but it's not the place or the position of number one. So that was the first remark I wanted to make about the US approach. Now, let me now concentrate on the EU's approach to China, and let me walk you through the evolution of this EU's approach to China. I would tend to argue that initially there was no such thing as an EU's approach to China. For a long time, there were different approaches to China depending on the economic interests of the various countries. So some countries that were tightly connected, tightly interlinked with China were extremely interested in keeping very good and close relations with China. Some others were not all that interested. There were also some European countries that were interested in China as a source of funding. And here I'm referring to the Central and Eastern European countries. Well, the reason why they embarked on the Belt and Road Initiative, for instance, was that they thought that they would get some money out of it. So they were very much interested. The other economies in the western part of the EU were not all that interested, and this is why none of them, except for Italy for a small little time, but it was, I think, a major mistake, but anyway. But all the other Western European countries, EU countries, did not embark on the BRI. So various interests, various approaches to China, more or less favorable to China depending on their own economic interests. But so it was very, very, heterogeneous, and there was not really a very consistent, coherent strategy vis-à-vis China. Of course, this changed over time. And the major change came, and it has been recalled earlier, in 2019, where there was an official communication by the EU, which identified China as three things at the same time. China being a partner in some areas, and in particular in the favorite area that is always quoted as an area for cooperation, which is climate change, even though I don't really see anything concrete, but everybody says, oh, well, that's the perfect area for cooperation. Anyway, so partner, first thing. China is also potentially a competitor, All right? And the third thing that China is a systemic rival. And this is the part that China hates. Being a partner, okay. Being a competitor, okay. But being called a systemic rival, they don't like it. I guess the reason why they don't like it is that they don't exactly understand what we mean by that. And it really means that we have different values, that we have different ways of operating, and they don't like, I guess, us to underscore these differences. But so this is what the communication said, and this brought some coherence in the approach to China. Over time, to be honest, the various coefficients placed on these three things changed. And over time, the coefficient that is placed on the systemic rivalry aspect is much heavier than on the two other aspects. But what is important here is that there is now a relatively coherent approach to China. And interestingly, the famous, change through trade approach that was very much favored by Germany, this has been dropped. Okay, so I guess the EU opened its eyes on the reality of the challenge coming from China. The interesting thing, are you moving your hands? Yes, 2 minutes, okay. So the interesting thing in this whole story is that all this pushed the EU to really get its act together and to develop new instruments, new policies to be able to respond to the Chinese challenge. So what we have seen over time is the strengthening of existing instruments, in particular the trade defense instruments, as well as the creation of new instruments. And here I'm referring, for instance, to the anti-coercion instrument, to the new mechanism to screen investment. A number of instruments have been put in place to be, for the EU to be able to face this Chinese challenge. So this is rather positive. Well, now the EU has also developed a new strategy, the famous de-risking strategy. I won't dwell too long on that because it has been done very eloquently by previous speakers. Just one brief word about that. The economic security strategy developed by the EU is based on 3 Ps, which more or less square with what the US has, which is not 3 Ps, but IAC, if I understand properly. I think 3 Ps is more sexy, huh? And easier to remember. So the 3 Ps are promote, protect, partner. So the promote would equal the invest, I guess. Partner would equal align. And protect, I'm not too sure that really aligns with compete, but anyway, we can perhaps discuss that. So this is the positive aspect, that this fight or this challenge posed by China has pushed the EU to develop new policies. Let me conclude perhaps on one largely, I think, misunderstood concept that is associated with what I just said, and that is at the heart of the EU's policy, and which is strategic autonomy. And the reason why I would like to explain that is that it was something that was proposed by the French president. Usually, well, he is very good, Macron I mean, he is very good at proposing new things. He is excellent, but nobody understands exactly what he means. And this is also very often the case. As far as strategic autonomy is concerned, what it means, I think, and I'm not referring here to the hard security part of strategic autonomy. I'm referring to strategic autonomy very broadly defined. And it is really about the ability of the EU, in this case, to identify or define its own interests and to define the means to protect and defend these interests. So it's really about having a say and not following blindly the big ally, which is the US. I think this is exactly what he meant on the plane coming back from Beijing. But the way he put it was, and associating it with Taiwan was a major mistake, I think, and it was a major mistake of communication. This is why I feel that I had to correct that and explain exactly what he meant. Perhaps I misunderstood him, I don't know, but I hope not. So at the end, and in conclusion, let's be positive. I think that the rising tension between the US and China may actually turn out to be a blessing in disguise, as it forced the EU to better define precisely its interests and objectives, to push its own line toward more strategic autonomy, and ultimately to move away from being an object of international relations to become a subject of international relations. So it's not a player or a playground, but turning away from being an object to being a subject. Thank you.
So somehow it's amazing how we get used to this new vocabulary. I mean, it's at least when you are not an economist, like the risking, the coupling, and the friendshoring, and etc. But it is what it is. And I'd like to make pose two questions, and then you have the word, and you can say and you can ask your own questions. Before coming, I'd like to know if you agree with this sentence I read before coming, that US response to China is more aggressive and the EU is more defensive. And the EU is always lagging behind what others do. And for example, we have this initiative, the Global Gateway, which should be like an answer to the Road and Belt Initiative, which, by the way, has increased the Chinese power in the global south and its attractiveness. So aggressive versus defensive, would you agree with that? Then I always wonder whether this history about decoupling is more wishful thinking than anything, because I was reading before coming also some percentages about crucial raw materials and minerals. Where are they in the world? Where are they located, right? And the EU has almost none, and China has a lot of them. Rare earth minerals, for example, which are crucial also for green transition and other uses, are in huge amounts in China. So to what extent, or some amounts in China, so to what extent this is really going to happen if you don't have the raw materials to take control of the industrial processes? And finally, I'd like to know whether you consider other countries like India, for example, to be an alternative somehow to some of the processes that are now located in China, and especially this role that China has had of the global factory, as Jan said. Is this role going to change, and is other countries can substitute China in this role? Thank you.
Oh, shall I start? From the middle, okay. Okay, strange order, yeah. Okay, I kind of take the second question. I think I'll leave the first one because that's how we split it up. Decoupling, yeah. So decoupling, I think, yes, you basically pointed out the problems. With crucial raw materials, so how does one actually shift away from China when one has become so integrated with China in so many areas? And I think actually raw materials is the smallest problem, because you're talking about rare earths, and China's producing a lot of the rare earths. But there are many, but that just happened. So many other places in the world understand that actually these factories or these production of rare earths has been closed down, but there are alternatives that one could reopen. So I understand that this is possible, but it will take several years to reopen these other sites. But at the moment, there's a strong dependence there. The bigger problem, which I find more complicated, is manufacturing supply chains, because China is just so good at producing for things very, very, very cheaply at very low cost. And other countries have difficulties repeating that, like India. You mentioned India. They want to do it, and they're looking for opportunities to replace China, and some companies are moving out of China and are moving to these places. But if it leads actually to a full decoupling, that is the question. I think these countries, these countries would need to take big steps still to be able to compete with China on costs, and to compete with China on things like efficiency and productivity in manufacturing and quality as well. So I think that would be very difficult for decoupling, and we are dependent on so many important goods there from China. I mean, talking about medicines, for example, things are very important, and actually, important for people's health and so on. And you hear that most of certain medicines come from China, and that is not a state that one could keep probably when one talks about the aim of decoupling. So there has to be another solution somewhere else, but it will be costly and you will not be able to get these goods at the same price probably.
Mary?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. Obviously, I think that diversification is important, and we have to be patient. It's not going to happen overnight. You know, there's the old saying, Rome wasn't built in a day. Well, global value chains weren't built in a day. They were built over the last 30 years. They're complex networks, and we have to really begin to support other countries in their quest to have a role in the global value chains. Unfortunately, I think we're also just adding on a whole bunch of stuff. We want to raise labor standards, raise environmental standards, decarbonize at the same time. This is going to increase the costs as well as just moving production away from the most efficient producer in the world. So I think we also have to be realistic. How are we going to create a bubble in the EU and the US where we have these very high cost things that we produce ourselves or from other high cost countries where we have this insistence? How do we allow countries that are lower income than to take advantage of having low wages? They have low wages because they have low productivity and they have a lot of, they want to come up. How do we support that? That is not insist that they be us today, but to build them on the way to be us in 20 years. China showed us that that kind of growth is possible. It's happening in Vietnam. It can happen elsewhere. So I would say patience, take the long view. People always say the Chinese take the long view. We need to have a little bit of that, take the long view, start to make investments outside of our countries to create the kinds of diversification we need. Lastly, I would just say strategy. We can't do it in everything. There's no need to do it in everything. Everything we get from China is simply not a national security risk. So let's be realistic. Let's put our money where it needs to be. And we're going to be raising costs for taxpayers. They're not going to like it. So we're going to have to articulate and explain to them why it's being done. So I think getting this vision, where do we need to be coupling? Where do we not need to decouple? Those are both equally important.
Yes, so to your first question, well, yeah, I fully agree with that. I mean, the US is definitely more aggressive. The EU is always late. I mean, well, for many reasons that I mentioned, you know, it takes time for the 27 to agree on something. So it is always late and slightly more defensive. So I would fully concur with what you said. As for the reorganization of supply chains, reshuffling and all that, well, what we see, well, we hear a lot of talks about that. What we don't see much happening. And the reason why we don't see that happening is that it is indeed costly. And I think that it may be nice to talk about reshuffling of the value chains, but if it is to replace, low cost and so cheap products by high cost, expensive products, as Marie said, the consumers is not going to like that. And this is something that has to be taken into account. So the decoupling or the de-risking, rather, should be selective, so limited to some goods, but not all of them. Mm-hmm. And in this case, some countries can indeed replace China for some very specific productions, and this is the case for Vietnam. It's the case for a number of other Southeast Asian economies. As far as India is concerned, I think there is a lot of talk about India being in the position to replace China. I think this is not the case. I mean, India doesn't have exactly the same history as China in terms of economic structure, economic specialization. It is an economy that has developed based on the service sector and not manufacturing. And India has huge weaknesses in its manufacturing activities. So, of course, it can produce some stuff. I'm not saying it doesn't produce anything. But it is more specifically specialized in service activities. And so the structure of the economy is totally different. So I don't see India, replacing China overnight. On top of that, if you talk to companies interested in investing in India, they say, well, China is a complicated place, but India is also very complicated for different reasons. But it's, a bureaucratic hell. It is really, really very costly also to start investing in India. So I don't see India as a potential replacement anytime soon, at least.
Thank you. So if you have any questions, please go ahead. You first.
Well, I had another point about the
Oh,
rare
okay.
earth thing. Yeah, the rare earth story, this is a purely man-made dependency. The reason why China has concentrated most of the rare earth production is because we let China do it. Because this is super dirty, so nobody wanted to do it.
Sure.
So let China do it. All right? And at the end of the day, China is actually producing 90+% of rare earth. Okay? This is man-made. So it's not because China holds the rare earth. I mean, there are rare earth all over the place. But it is complicated and it is dirty to produce them, to extract them, process them, blah, blah. And so this is, yeah, man-made dependency. But
Thanks. Sir, please.
Thank you very much. And instead of asking a question, I would like to make some commentary.
that was expected.
Finally.
I think I might be the only Asian face or Chinese face here, but it is a very good opportunity for me to be here present. And I was expecting that the words are harsher on China, more attacks, but obviously the tone is softer than I expected. I hope it's not because I am here. I have been taking notes with my heart, and some of the points I think they are very good, and you have made your points. And for me, because I'm the representative of China, so I have to stand out and say something. And our president Xi Jinping said the Pacific Ocean is wide enough for China and US. That's what he said in a speech. I think it's a very good speech, and I love that. So I'm always telling my people and telling my audience that the Pacific Ocean is wide enough for both China and US. Of course, for EU as well. And I'm a fan of American culture, the pop culture, and there are McDonald's everywhere in China. And the American companies are very popular in China. I was reading some commentary from Global Times, and it's saying that President Biden was making a speech in a harbor recently, and then he noticed that the heavy lifter there was made in China. And then what should we do? Then we should reject these products from China, and then we will develop the heavy lifter production in the US. But then he was thinking, maybe you don't have this capacity because 80% of heavy lifters are produced in China. So what should we do? Then you said, okay, we will turn to Japan, because Japan can produce heavy lifters. That's some story that I was reading. But I have a sense that being hard on China has become a political correctness in the US society, especially in this season of the election season. So if you're hard on China, you can get more votes. That's unfortunately and sadly it's the reality. And I guess that both the people in China and both the people in US don't like this. But anyway, that's the reality. What can we do about this? So the Chinese people actually, we understand. It's just the reality. But I'm very glad to be here, to be present, to listen the speakers on US-EU alignment and divergence on China policy. That's a good topic because everybody is talking about China. There are some points that I need to make.
But not very long, eh?
I could speak for like 2 hours. I need 2 hours, but anyway, I'm not allowed for this 2 hours, so I'm going to try to be brief. Point one, the forced labor. I think there's no forced labor in China. The cotton in Xinjiang, because 80% of the cotton are picked by machines. So forced labor is not a reality in China, especially in Xinjiang area. And then the Taiwan question, I need half a day to elaborate on the complexity of the Taiwan question. But I want to tell you that Taiwan is part of China and it's recognized by the majority of the world. But some people are trying to provoke this issue so that the Chinese people will be angry and to use force. And we don't like that. So that's a very complex issue. And I just want to say that the question of Taiwan is complex, and China is not the culprit for that because it's involved a lot of factors. All right. Mm-hmm. And the Russian-Ukraine war, China may have some influence, but the real power is the U.S. If the U.S. wants to stop the war, it has the power to stop the war. That's my opinion is that. And then I'm trying to be brief, okay? Then about the Huawei, I think the U.S. is trying to crack down on Huawei because it's becoming a threat to the U.S. dominance. But anyway, because we believe that Huawei, there's no backdoor, or it's not a question of national threat. It's just like a competition. And this competition is becoming not a healthy one, but it's becoming using a national weapon, a national force to crack down on one Chinese company. And that's not a good sign. And then for the Chinese economy, we believe that the next China will still be China. And also one suggestion, we should think how we should engage with China. We think China is not a threat, rather it is an opportunity. Both EU and the US should take this opportunity, this grand opportunity, to develop yourself instead of trying to contain China. That's all what I want to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's good to have a voice from China, because otherwise it was a bit unbalanced, right? Yes. So next one, any other questions, please? Or if you want to elaborate further comments on what he said, we can wait for two or three questions, okay? This young man over there.
Thank you. I'm Arnau Broso Ibáñez, postgraduate student from the eBay. And I have two questions. The first one is about the structural issues, the structural problems that were mentioned at the beginning. Because if we take all them into account, now the perspective or paradigm about China has changed, and now it's that the Chinese economy is going bad no matter what. No, the Chinese miracle has ended, and that if these problems continue, especially for example, the demographic one, how this will affect the relation between that it's a very strange relation between wealth and geopolitical power. So a China that has all these problems in this decade and maybe in the next one will not be able to continue or in this position or in this direction. And my second question is about the strategic autonomy that was mentioned at the last moment, because in my view, the Chinese leadership, the Chinese elites have always seen this European strategic autonomy as something good, as something that is positive, that is good for China and good for Europe, and they really want to have this strategic autonomy. But I don't know really why, because it can be like in a way like the way of Macron, that it was a bit submissive, at least how it was interpreted, or it can be a very not anti, but very hard position of China for many European countries. So yeah.
Okay, thank you. Any other question, and we will answer them. This here, please. Thanks.
Thank you very much for the very insightful discussion. My name is Monika Prushinovska, and I'm a Maria Zambrano Fellow at the University of Barcelona. I have a question about US-EU alignment and or divergence and creating a reasonable, healthy counterbalance to China. I think there is a whole number of areas that probably for the sake of time was not really addressed today, but I would like to, for the sake of providing a bit more comprehensive picture, what type of alignment are we having between US and EU when it comes to, for instance, approaching the regions like Latin America? So we've been discussing a bit today about critical materials. I wouldn't really underlook that because it's essential for the energy transition, and everybody is interested in it, including US, including China, including European Union. So I feel that there are areas that are largely unexplored when it comes to creating the type of counterbalance when it comes to China's action, for instance, in Bolivia. If we think about Latin America, if we think about lithium, which is an essential white gold for the energy transition, are we having any US-EU alignment on that type of areas? What is your take on that? If not, what should be the direction? Because so far I see obviously US rhetorics and discussion about the triangular relationship US-China in Latin America. But what's the place for US-EU alignment in that type of areas? This is just obviously an example, but I feel that there is more to create alignment. What is your take on that when it comes to this type of strategic critical minerals and resources?
Thank you. So we'll answer those because we have quite a few questions on the table. So if you want to start, Francois, for example.
Okay, well, I'll respond to the strategic autonomy question, of course. Well, I guess the reason why China perceives that as positive is because China, like the others, misunderstands strategic autonomy. So they understand it as being anti-US, so to speak, as the EU distancing itself from the US. And they like it, of course, because they would like to drive a wedge between the EU and the US. So they're quite happy with it. But it's not the case. As I explained, it means, strategic autonomy is not blind alignment with the US. So this bit is correct. But it does not mean equidistance. And at the end of the day, the US is an ally. So the EU, is closer to the US than to China, for sure. But it doesn't want to align blindly with the US and to follow the US interests. And this is where I think that the comment made by Macron on the plane, this is what he wanted to point to. That we don't want to follow the US if the US interests are not aligned with our own interests. We don't want to be embarked on some fight which is not our own fight. This is what he said. And I think this is exactly the definition of strategic autonomy. But it is misunderstood, I think, or misinterpreted by our Chinese friends. And that's why they see it as positive, but it's not that positive for them. It is just the assessment, the assertion of our own interests, which may be distinct from the US interests in some cases. So I think that it should be very clear, but I'm afraid it's not very clear. Another thing I wanted to pick up on a comment you made about the Pacific, which is broad enough for the US, China, and you said, and the EU perhaps. And I like that. France being behind the EU's Indo-Pacific strategy, okay, we are very much in favor of the Indo-Pacific strategy for very good reasons. We have territories, we have citizens there, we have interest in the Indo-Pacific. That's why we try to embark the others, and we managed to embark the others, the other 27, on the EU's Indo-Pacific strategy. So I'm glad to hear that the Indo-Pacific is broad enough for all of us. Thank you.
Jan or Marie, you want to answer?
Okay. Yes, I'll respond to your comments actually first. Potentially one can agree with all five of them. Potentially no forced labor in Xinjiang. Problem is we cannot be sure from our point of view. Taiwan, part of China, yes, maintain the status quo. Actually, I think that's broad policy. A lot of us agree about it. China has some influence over Russia. Okay, sure. Huawei is not, I didn't quite get the end of the point, but Huawei is presumably not a security threat. Again, we cannot be sure, and that's the problem, right? And with the Chinese economy, opportunity not a threat, yes, but we cannot be sure. So that is the problem, right? We cannot be sure, and I think that triggers these uncertainties, right, here in the West, and all these responses. One concern I had was the comments in a sub-sentence, and apologies if I got you wrong, but if the point on Taiwan is that some people provoke China to use force on Taiwan, I don't like that point. If mainland China attacks Taiwan, it will be mainland China attacking Taiwan. We're not going to engage in the NATO argument that NATO provoked Russia to invade Ukraine. I think we have to be careful about thinking in that direction, right? So to get a false precedent to do this kind of thing. That's the only kind of, I can agree with many other points you made actually that we are not certain about them. And on structural problems in China, I think they weaken China, and I think there might be an opportunity for US, EU there that is not sufficiently discussed. So China may be weak now, and the question is that an opportunity or not? So maybe this is something that can be explored more in 2024, actually. In particular, it might promote the decoupling agenda, right? China has a big problem keeping labor costs low, for example, right? So that could support the decoupling agenda. And alignment, US-EU alignment on rare earths, just very quickly. Yes, one could do something together to exploit more rare earth in South America or somewhere. I think one thing to watch, of course, is China is actually acquiring a lot of these sites in these places, right? So that might be concern number one from a US and EU perspective.
Yeah, for example, in Bolivia, I am aware that Chinese companies have an agreement to exploit some of the lithium. So.
At the end of the day, we all have an interest, abstracting ourselves for a moment from Latin America, because we tend to speak about let's go and let's see how much of share each of us can have, US, China, and EU, forgetting about Bolivia in this specific instance. But that's the question. Yes, it's visible in terms of agreements, specific agreements between, for instance, Bolivia and China and Latin America or elsewhere. But the question is, in this type of instances, what can we do in terms of creating a counterbalance as the alignment between US and EU? Are we working on that? Are we having a vision of that? Or are we waiting to then, in a moment, to say that, you know, China is everywhere and is extracting everything? So that's the question. How can we approach it better, I guess, right, in terms of alignment?
I mean, I believe we are working together on this. And you have to think about what's going to happen. You're going to have to create new mines and new refiners. We have a lot of the minerals are more prevalent than one might think. And we also want to, as I said about the layering on top, we want to raise labor standards within the mines. We want to make sure the refining is clean. So we're basically, you know, the old joke I've used is like a buyer's club usually wants to get a really low price. We want to create a buyer's club that's willing to pay a high price. So for not just critical minerals, but, you know, critical minerals. So that's what we're doing. And it's clear that we have to get those kinds of investments, but it is part of a vision of how this energy transformation is going to happen. Is this energy transformation going to be one that we see also raises standards, and in some sense is a just transition? It's going to be costly, so we can't pretend it isn't.
Okay.
I just wanted to add one thing about China, whether China's growing, you know, 5 or 10 or what. There's many structural changes that. In problems that China has to respond to. China's future is in China's hands, and I think that we're ill-served by people who overestimate Chinese growth and power, and ill-served by those who underestimate it. We have to prepare for a world in which we have taken account of risks as the world really is, which is why I always try to fight against people who, the other way, right? And part of that is, I think, diversifying, investing. I think we're starting to make the right moves, whether China grows faster than 5% or slower than 5%. So in some sense, I think our representative from China was right, which is we need to focus on our own development. We are doing that, and we're taking steps to make our supply chains more resilient. And I think the world, in some sense, is a safer place because we won't be able to be so vulnerable.
Thank you then. All good things come to an end, so we run out of time as always. So thank you very much for coming. We have some minutes left for the final parliaments by Jacint Jordana and Conseller Meritxell Serret. Thank you very much for coming. I think it's been great. I've learned a lot. I hope you have to learn as I have. And we wait for you for next session next year maybe, right? Okay, thanks.